When we turn around and we say that just because a truth hurts someone's feelings, that we're going to let them be naive, we're not helping them at all. In fact, we're hurting them because we're encouraging them to start making decisions based off of things that are not true. And that means that we're encouraging them to eventually create self-destructive decisions.
And it's really simple because if you start with the wrong perspective, you'll make the wrong choice. I'm not out to hurt anyone's feelings, but between politically correct or correct, I'll choose the last.
Hello and welcome to the Chris F. Walker Podcast. I am Chris F. Walker. This is episode 8 of our podcast series, and today is going to be a great topic because this is one of the things that has ultimately become one of the standard staple points for a lot of the work that I do when I do a lot of my speaking. We're going to be talking today about seeking an outside truth. What does that mean? Outside truth is a truth that is known to be true by everyone so that it can be trusted. And you see, what's interesting is that in today's society, we seem to have that viewpoint that a lot of times we think that what's really true is what we feel about something. If I like it, then it must be good. Or if I don't like it, it must be bad. And we also have a hard time with trying to convey to people that just because your feelings get hurt does not necessarily mean that you're right. One of the kind of fun play on words that I'll often use is that if I've offended someone, I don't mean to offend people. Don't get me wrong. I don't go out of my way to do it. But I also refuse to stand away from hardline truths. And so when someone then turns around and they say, I'm offended by that, the first thing I turn around is I say, well, your offense gives me offense. So who's right? Because if I'm offended and therefore I'm right, and you're offended and therefore you're right, then we have a very serious problem. Because there is no right in that concept, and that's actually what people try to do is they say, well, there just is no right answer. And the problem is there are right answers. And it's those outside truths that we actually really need to pursue. But today, as I go through the topic of an outside truth, what I'm really trying to convey is I want to explain and express that it's not me saying this because this is my viewpoint, and therefore, because it's your viewpoint and my viewpoint's different, we can all just say that, we can agree to disagree. We've gotten to an unhealthy stage of that in our lives and society today. There are certain things that are true, and we have to say that they're true. When we turn around and we say that just because a truth hurts someone's feelings, that we're going to let them be naive, we're not helping them at all. In fact, we're hurting them, because we're encouraging them to start making decisions based off of things that are not true. And that means that we're encouraging them to eventually create self-destructive decisions. So the topic today is to just wrap our head around what an outside truth means. I'm not trying to explain all the different outside truths that are out there. I just want to express what outside truth is. How does it apply? How do we actually convey and trust things like outside truths when ultimately they might be counterintuitive to what our internal feelings are telling us? So I love to use a very, very specific example that goes into context in this. What I do, especially when I'm in a crowd, is I'll have everyone stand up, and this is a great little exercise by all means, as long as you're not driving around right now. If you're someplace where you can stand, go ahead and do this. Close your eyes, stand up, point one finger straight up into the air, and then when I say go, what I'd love for you to do is I'd love for you to go ahead and point the direction of north. Okay? So with eyes closed, just get ready to do it, and go. So you point now, and hopefully you're pointing at north. If you're by yourself, you're gonna have to just kind of use some self-truth and decide whether or not you're right or not. And we'll find out here in a minute, but I'll explain how. And if you're around other people and you do this exercise, a great thing to do is everybody keep pointing in the same direction, but then look around at each other and see who's pointing north. Because according to us, all of us are pointing north. That's an internal truth. We're making our best guess off of something that we just feel. Now, if we have some people in the audience who are, in fact, pointing north, then they fall into one of two categories. One of them is they guessed right. They didn't know for sure. They thought maybe that direction. They put their finger down and it just happened to be correct. That happens sometimes. Sometimes we make choices and they just turn out to be correct. That doesn't mean that we made the correct choice. There's a big difference. You see, when we make correct choices, it's because we made it on purpose. We knew why it would work, and we chose to do it. But if we just did a choice and it worked out in our benefit, that doesn't necessarily mean that we made the right choice. It just means that the choice we made turned out to be right. And there's a big difference in that. So we've got to learn that that's not the point that we can rely on. If we make a choice and we didn't know what we were doing and it still worked out, that doesn't mean we're smart. That means that we just happened to pick the right choice. You know, even what's the phrase? Even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while. You've got to understand that until you can make deliberate choices based on truth, you're not making choices that are right. You just happen to be making choices that happen to work. And there's a difference because you're still not going to know why it didn't work or did work. And when you make another choice based off of the same logic and it doesn't work, you're not going to know why it didn't work. We need outside truth. So how do we determine if north is true? Well, because north doesn't rely on us. This is an example of an outside truth. North is north because that's the direction it is in relation to the planet, not us. It's an outside truth. Okay, so in relation to that, if we're trying to say, how do I feel out whether something or not is north, then what we need to understand is that we have to have something to gauge it off of. Another example of the other category for people who pointed in the right direction is that they actually knew what direction north was, but the way they knew it was in reference to something. For example, maybe they know that they're facing a certain direction in the building and that the building has a certain entrance at one side, and that side maybe faces east. And they know that in relation to that entrance, I'm facing this way, which then gives me the reference point I need to know that north is in that direction, and they point that way. And maybe they're standing next to a road, and the road they know runs east and west. So they know that means that when they point the other direction, that they're going to be going either north or south. But if they know what direction east and west is, then they have the ability to say that of those two, that means that one is north. There's a reference. And that's what outside truth gives us. Outside truth gives us the ability to refer to something to determine whether or not it actually is true. Doesn't matter how I feel about it. What matters is what it is. Just the bare basic concept of how it works. And that's something that we have to learn to detach our feelings from to be able to make good choices off of outside truths. Okay, and so when we come back, I'm going to go into a very, very detailed explanation using north about how that plays out so that we can truly understand the language used when it comes to things like truth versus perspective. Okay, so stick around. You're going to love this.
Please don't forget to follow and review the show today. Also, head over and register at the chrisfwalker.com website. There you'll find links to the Indiegogo and Patreon campaigns, which help keep this show going. You'll also find links to the bookstore, gear shop, blog, and you'll stay up to date on upcoming events and live appearances. Now, let's get back to today's message.
And welcome back. Today's podcast is talking about outside truths and being able to refer to them so that we can make decisions based off of truths that are known. A lot of times in society today, we tend to rely on our feelings a little more than we probably should. We just think that as long as it feels good, it is good, or as long as it feels bad, it is bad. And that's not always the case. So we need to learn how to actually apply outside perspectives to create truths. Now, I come from a military background. I served in the Army. And while I was in the Army, we did a good deal of training on land navigation. And there were some neat tricks that they taught us in relation of how we can move around on the earth around us, so long as we can refer to these outside truths. For example, north. And so I want to use those same references, the norths that are out there. And yes, there's plural because there's more than one. And I want to use those same references as an example that we can then turn around and we say that there are outside truths that we have to be able to base things off of. Okay, so let's talk about the military norths first. In the military, as far as land navigation goes, there are actually 3 norths. Okay, now the first north is the north that's called grid north. And that's the north on the map itself. The piece of paper that I'm holding in my hand has an up on it. And that up is north. And that's the grid north. But the problem is that that tells me how it looks on the map. What it doesn't do is it doesn't help align me to where I then can use it in relation to the ground and the area and the world that I'm actually standing in. It's just a reference, but it's not the reference that I can use to rely on for moving around. I have to line that up with something else. So in this case, the map would be kind of like our own internal morals and values. Okay, those are the kinds of things that we base our decisions off of, but we have to gauge them off of something external as well to decide whether or not they're lined up correctly. So the next north in military north is what's called magnetic north. Now, magnetic north is the north as it appears on the compass. And it's called that because obviously the Earth is just a great big magnet, and there's a polar north that all the magnets like to point to. But there's a few things about the magnetic north that a lot of people don't necessarily know. For example, magnetic north is not the same everywhere you go in the world. It changes as you travel around. And that's got to do with because the Earth itself is not just spinning around in a perfect circle, but it's actually got a small of an axis spin as well, which is why we get 4 seasons instead of just a day and a night, because there's a little bit more to the rotation. Well, that means that the magnetic north is not exactly top of how the Earth is spinning. So that north changes as we move around the globe. And also it can be influenced. Okay, if we are around an area that has a lot of lead contamination or a lot of maybe iron deposits, it can actually change how that needle points in a certain direction. And that's why on military maps, they actually have what's called a declination diagram, and that tells you the variance between a normal north and the north as it would appear on the magnet, meaning that the grid north and the magnetic north, they tell you the difference between those two in that region that you're at. And it's not going to be the same everywhere you go. And the reason why is because it's still determined by the world, but it's also influenced by the world. So we can use it a lot of times to tell, to get a good feeling on it, but that doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Now there is a third north, and that north is an absolute north. It doesn't change. To be perfectly clear, there's a small variation of this north all over the world, but it's so minute it almost doesn't matter. Okay, so this north is called true north, and it's the North Star. The North Star is called Polaris. It actually has its own name. And here's a little neat trick for you with the North Star. If you've never had to find it, here's how you can do that. You start with finding the Big Dipper, because that's a little bit easier to spot in the sky. Now, the Big Dipper is made up of a handle, and it's made up of 4 stars that make up the cup. Now, the cup opens in a certain direction, and you can tell what direction that is. Now, if you take your hand and you open it all the way, all 5 fingers spread wide, and then you place your thumb at the star that marks the outermost part of the cup in the direction that the cup would open. Okay, so if water was going to flow in, it's that side of the cup that you're going to use that star at the outermost point, so the furthest away from the handle. You put your thumb on that star, and then you rotate your hand while it's open so that the pinky and the thumb are now in line with the star that you're on, as well as the other star of the tip of the cup. So the other star that's away from the handle. Those 2 stars in alignment with your thumb and your pinky, when you look at your pinky, there should be a star right around there. That is Polaris. That's the North Star. Okay? Now, the reason why the North Star is called true north is because it cannot be influenced by any factors on this planet. It is constant. It just stays put. So because it's always there, whenever we're trying to determine which north we can really use, if we can find out with those norths that they're pointed towards the North Star, then we know that they're true. If it's a little bit off, then we know to compensate for it. Okay, we know that if that's true, and then this is saying that this is close to truth, well, close is not really true, so I need to still have the variance within there to make sure I'm staying true to truth. Okay, so the North Star is called true north because it cannot be changed. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there's a problem with the North Star. It can only be seen half the time. Unless it's nighttime, you're not going to get to see it. And the other thing is that it could be nighttime, and maybe you're in an area that's well lit or it's very cloudy and you can't see the stars. Then you still have a problem. You cannot see it. So the problem with absolute truth in this context is that it's not always easy to see. Sometimes we have to really look for it to find it. And the reason I bring all three of those norths as a context to this concept of whether or not we trust certain truths is because grid north shows us. That's the truth that we think it should be. We believe it should be this way. It's written out in our minds like this. Magnetic north is the north as everyone else around us tells us it should be. The world says it should be like this. The world says you'll be successful if you have this much money, or it'll says that you'll be educated if you achieve this degree. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to achieve success. And so when it comes to things like truth, we have to be able to rely on a truth that is absolute. And that is the key word that drives most people nuts when they don't want there to be an outside truth perspective, is they think that there are no absolutes, which is interesting because that statement itself is very contradictive. If there are no absolutes, how can you say it in an absolute context? There are absolutes. It's just nature. There are things that are. There will be a day, there will be a night. There is an up, there is a down. Green is going to be green every single time, and if it's not, I wouldn't be able to call it green anyway. So we have to be able to look for the truths that just are, that are unchangeable by either the world or ourselves, and those are then the things we have to use to refer to when we make our decisions as we navigate through the world around us. So the point of the topic today is to really hone in on it's good to seek outside truth, especially the kind that cannot be altered by outside perspectives. So, for example, the North Star isn't going to change. It can't. Unless we can get somebody up there to it to move it around, it will not move. That's where it's at. And that's why it's reliable. We want to find outside truths that are completely reliable. And as you make decisions in life, I hope you'll be willing to seek those kinds of truths before you start making your decisions. Otherwise, you might as well close your eyes, point in a direction, call it north, and take off walking. Hope you get where you're supposed to. I would hope that you have learned to place your hope in something more profound than that.
I realize your time is the most precious commodity you could possibly share with anyone. So I want to thank you again for spending some of yours here with me today. Don't forget to review the message for others. And be sure to follow the Chris F. Walker podcast for new releases. Remember, your generous support on sites like Indiegogo and Patreon are making this show possible. Don't forget to register at the chrisfwalker.com website for links to the bookstore, gear shop, and to stay updated for new events and appearances. I hope to see you again soon. God bless.